"Wives sit in back, dear." The words landed soft as ash, and they were meant to burn. Priscilla Vaughn said them the way a woman says them when she has said them 100 times and never once been answered. A small smile, a small tilt of the head, a hand lifted toward the far end of the ballroom as if she were offering a kindness instead of a wound. Behind her, the room blazed. 6 chandeliers hung like frozen fire over 300 guests. The brass of a string quartet moved beneath the noise, patient as water under ice. Dress blues and mess whites, and gowns the color of deep tide. Waiters threading the tables with trays that caught the light. And at the center of all of it, a head table draped in the colors, waiting for the important people to be told they were important. The woman she said it to wore a plain midnight gown and no rank at all. She was 44. Her dark hair was pinned back simply, no jewels in it, and she stood with a stillness that most people in that room had never learned and never would. She did not startle. She did not flush. She looked at Priscilla Vaughn the way still water looks at a stone dropped into it, taking the disturbance, giving nothing back. "Of course," she said. 2 words. She turned for the far tables. She had stood in rooms that wanted her dead. A seating chart did not frighten her. As she crossed the polished floor, she read it the way she read everything. The exits first. 3 of them. The service doors behind the quartet, the head table, and the flag hung behind it. The knots of people, and which knots were cruel and which were only afraid. One pass of her eyes, and she had the whole room. It was an old habit, and it never switched off. It had kept her alive when better people had died, and it did not know how to leave her now just because the danger here wore perfume instead of dust. The candlelight caught something on her lapel as she moved. A small rosette, no wider than a coin, a pale and particular shade of light blue. A waiter passed within a foot of it and saw nothing. Priscilla Vaughn had looked straight at it and seen nothing. To the room it was costume, a bit of ribbon a woman had pinned to a plain dress because the dress was plain. Nobody in 300 people knew what it was. One man did. By the entrance stood a command sergeant major named Ezra Whitlock, 49 years old, thick through the shoulders, gray coming in at the temples, a career soldier in his dress uniform who had learned long ago to stand where he could see a room whole. He had watched the woman in the midnight gown get waved to the back. He had watched her go without a word. And then the light had shifted on her lapel, and he had seen the small blue rosette, and Ezra Whitlock went very still. He did not look away. He could not. A man who has spent 30 years in the army learns exactly one pin on sight, learns it the way he learns his own name. And it is not a pin you expect to find on a plain dress being sent to the back of a ballroom. He turned the thing over in his mind and could not make it fit, and the not fitting held him where he stood. Priscilla had already forgotten the woman. She turned back to her chart and her line and her evening, the queen of a court she had built for herself out of other women's husbands' ranks. A major's wife came through the receiving line and was greeted warmly. A captain's wife came through and was greeted less warmly. Each was measured in a heartbeat and placed. It was a machine Priscilla had run for years, and it ran well, and it had never once been made to answer for itself. The woman she had banished walked the length of the room and sat where she was told, quiet as a closed door. A woman sent to the back of the room, and one old soldier by the doors who could not stop staring at a pin the size of a coin. The back tables were where the ball put the people it believed it did not need, the lieutenants' wives, the +1s, the ones without a title that mattered. Adele Marchetti sat among them without complaint, and for a little while the room forgot she existed. She folded her hands. She let the noise wash over her. She had spent a career learning to be unremarkable on purpose, and she was very good at it. Then a tray went down. A young woman 2 seats over had risen too fast and caught a steward's tray with her elbow, and a dozen glasses hit the floor like a bright, brief rain. The young woman, she could not have been more than 26, in a borrowed-looking gown, already near tears from an evening that had not been kind to her, froze in horror. And past her, at the next table, a heavy-set man in a colonel's mess dress had a canapé go down the wrong way. His color changed. His hand went to his collar. The small sounds he made were the sounds of a man who cannot get air, and around him people did what people do, which is turn and stare and be useless. Adele Marchetti was up before anyone at the head table had turned. She did not run. She moved the way a current moves, unhurried and total, and she was behind the man with her arms around him before his wife had finished gasping. Her hands found the spot below the ribs. She counted it under her breath, calm as a metronome. "Breathe," she said. And then, low. 2 more. The third pull cleared it. The canapé struck the tablecloth. The man dragged in a long, ragged breath, and then another, and the color came back into his face like tide returning to a flat. 40 seconds, start to finish. She had him breathing in under 40 seconds, and she had done it without raising her voice or knocking over so much as a water glass. Then she settled the man back into his chair, checked his eyes once, and stepped away before his thanks could find her. Someone asked her, in the flurry after, what she did for a living. Adele Marchetti straightened her plain gown and gave them 3 words. Old habit. Medic. Then she sat back down at the far table, and that was all she would say about it. The woman beside her, the young one with the borrowed gown, stared at her as though she had grown wings, and Marchetti only shook her head slightly, as if to say it was nothing, and looked back out at the room. A senior wife 2 tables up had watched the save with her mouth pursed, and now she said, to no one and to everyone, that it was a wonder they let just anybody in these days, that a real lady would have called for a doctor and let the professionals handle it, rather than throwing herself across a table like that. A little laughter agreed with her. It was easier to laugh than to admit that the woman in the plain gown had done in 40 seconds what none of them would have known how to begin. Marchetti heard it. Her expression did not change by the width of a hair. She had been laughed at by better rooms than this, in worse gowns, on worse nights, and it had never once been the thing that broke her. The blue rosette on her lapel caught the light again as she reached for her water, small and quiet and unread, and the ball rolled on over the top of it like a river over a stone. Ezra Whitlock had watched the whole thing from the doors, and it told him what the rosette had already told him, only louder. There is a difference between a nurse who has practiced on a mannequin and a soldier who has done this in the dark, with the world coming apart. And the difference is in the hands, in the count, in the way the panic never once reaches the face. He had seen that difference in exactly one kind of person across a whole career. He watched her fold back into stillness at the back of the room, the blue rosette catching the light again as she sat, and he understood then that he knew what she was, even if he did not yet know her name. At the head table, Priscilla Vaughn was annoyed. The back tables had made a scene, and a scene at her ball was a personal failure. She smoothed it over the way she smoothed everything, gathering the program back to the front where it belonged, and the room forgot the choking man inside of a minute. Whitlock did not forget the woman who had fixed it in 40 seconds. If the first hour of Priscilla Vaughn's ball had a religion, it was rank, not the wearer's, but the wearer's husband. She moved table to table like a bishop confirming the faithful, and everywhere she went, she rearranged people according to a hierarchy only she fully understood. A hierarchy of who had married, how high, and how recently, and how well. She reached the young woman with the borrowed gown, Josie Lambert, a second lieutenant's wife, married 10 months, at her first ball, and drowning in it. And Priscilla studied the place card and the table, and found them both wanting. "We seat by what your husband earned, dear," Priscilla said, pleasant as poison. "Not by what you'd like. A second lieutenant is a fine thing to be starting out as. But there's a chair for you at the back, with the others who are starting out." She said back, the way another woman might say, "Gutter." Josie Lambert gathered her small clutch and her large humiliation and went. And the table she was sent to was the far one, and the seat she was given was beside the quiet woman in the midnight gown. She sat down with her chin trembling and her eyes bright and fixed hard on the tablecloth so that no one would see them spill. Adele Marchetti pulled the chair out for her before she reached it. She said one thing, quietly, meant for no one else. "Sit. You're fine here." That was all. But the girl's chin steadied. Marchetti's eyes moved once around the room, unhurried, and finished the map she had begun at the door. She knew now, with the certainty of long practice, exactly who in this ballroom was cruel, and exactly who was only frightened of the woman being cruel. It was not a large distinction, but it was the whole distinction, and she had staked her life on it before. "She does that to everyone the first year," Marchetti said, low, when the girl had steadied. "It isn't about you. It was never going to be about you." "You've been," Josie managed. "A long time ago." 2 words more than she usually gave. She left it there. A knot of senior wives near the middle of the room laughed toward the back table, a bright, carrying laugh, and they let it be understood who it was aimed at. One of them said, just loudly enough, that some people would put on any old dress and wander in hoping to be mistaken for someone. Another wondered aloud whether the back table came with a discount. The insult was social and bloodless and complete, the kind that leaves no mark and does all its damage anyway. Marchetti's stillness did not break. Josie Lambert flinched at each new laugh, as though the sound had edges. Marchetti did not. She reached over, once, and refilled the girl's water glass and set it down where her hand could find it, and that small, ordinary courtesy did more to steady the girl than anything the front of the room had offered her all night. There is a kind of person, the ball was learning without knowing it was learning, who does not get smaller when a room decides to make her small. She had been made small by experts, on ground where the stakes were her life and other people's, and she had not gotten smaller then either. The rosette on her lapel sat quiet in the candlelight, a small blue truth that no one had bothered to read. Whitlock, by the doors, stopped a passing steward and asked, low, who the woman in the midnight gown was, the one at the back, dark hair, plain dress. The steward checked his folded list and came back apologetic. She was not on it. There was no name for her at all. That, to Ezra Whitlock, was the answer. In his experience, the ones who mattered most were never on the list. They came in quiet, took the seat they were given, fixed what needed fixing, and left before anyone learned their names. The list was for people who needed to be seen. This woman didn't need to be seen. She had spent a career, he was now certain, being exactly the opposite. Think for a moment about what that back table held. A young wife in tears because a room decided her husband was not important enough. A decorated soldier no one would seat, watching over her without being asked. And 300 people up front who thought the cruelty was the entertainment. If that turns something over in you, if it makes you want to watch the room learn what it is doing, then stay close, because the tables are about to turn. And this is exactly what this channel is for. Subscribe to Honor Tales and see it through. The disrespect, having run out of social room, turned official. Priscilla Vaughn returned to the check-in table near the doors and found the evening's one loose thread still untrimmed, a guest with no name on her list. It offended her the way a crooked picture offends a certain kind of person, not because it mattered, but because she could not stop seeing it. She summoned the protocol officer, a nervous young lieutenant whose whole assignment tonight was to keep Mrs. Vaughn content. "If she's not on my list, she is not a guest," Priscilla said. "Have her walked out. Quietly, if she can manage quiet. This is an evening for people who earned their place in the room, and I will not have it turned into a shelter for whoever wandered in off the street in a dress from 10 years ago." The lieutenant crossed the floor with the expression of a man sent to do something he already regretted. He reached the back table and bent close and asked, with real apology in it, whether the lady would mind stepping outside. There seemed to be a question about the guest list, and Mrs. Vaughn was very particular about the guest list. Adele Marchetti looked up at him. She did not argue. She did not name herself. She would not make a scene at a soldier's ball. Not for her own sake, not ever, because the night belonged to the young officers being honored, and not to her. "All right," she said, and rose. She was halfway to standing when a wall arrived between her and the door. Ezra Whitlock had crossed the room fast for a big man, and now he stood square in the path to the exit, and he had made a decision that 30 years had prepared him to make. "She's not going anywhere," Whitlock said to the lieutenant. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It was the voice of a command sergeant major, and it closed the subject like a hatch dogged down. "Get the presiding officer, now." The lieutenant looked between them. Whitlock's eyes had dropped, once, deliberately, to the small blue rosette on the woman's lapel, and stayed there a beat, willing the young man to look and understand. "Sergeant Major," the lieutenant said, low and miserable. "Mrs. Vaughn was very clear. If I don't move her, it's my evening that's over." "Son," Whitlock said, and there was something almost kind in it now. The way a man is kind to someone about to make a mistake he can still stop. "If you put a hand on this woman to walk her out of here, it's a good deal more than your evening. Go and get the presiding officer. Let the adults sort out who belongs in this room." The lieutenant did not understand what the pin meant, but he understood the sergeant major, which for the moment was enough, and he went to find the Admiral, glad to be given any errand that took him away from the two of them. At the head table, Priscilla saw the disturbance from across the room, her tidy removal turning into a standoff at the back doors, and her patience, never deep, ran dry. She leaned to her husband, Colonel Gerald Vaughn, a man with a good jaw and better ambitions, who had spent the evening being pleasant to everyone who might one day sit on a promotion board. "Gerald," she said, "there's a disturbance at the back. That woman, and now that sergeant major making a scene about her. It is your ball as much as mine. Handle it." The colonel frowned, glanced back at the standoff, and gave the small nod of a man who has learned it is easier to move than to argue. And with that, the colonel's authority and the wife's pride were both fully committed to removing the one person in the room who outranked them all in the only way that would matter before the night was through. The order to remove her had been given, and the only man in 300 who understood what the small blue pin meant was standing in the doorway, refusing to move. Ezra Whitlock did not wait for the lieutenant to fail. He crossed instead to the side of the head table, to the still point beside the presiding admiral where the aides stood, and he spoke to the admiral's flag aide, the way you speak when a building is on fire, and you are the only one who has noticed. Blue rosette. Left lapel, Whitlock said, low and fast. Back table, midnight gown, dark hair. I need you to walk over there and look at it, right now, before somebody throws a recipient out of a military ball, and this becomes the worst night of every career in this room. The aide's face changed. It went the color of the tablecloth. He did not ask which recipient of what. There is only one decoration that lives on a light blue ribbon, only one that a man like Whitlock would name like an alarm, and every officer learns it in the first week of a commission if he learns nothing else. The aide set off across the floor without another word. By the doors, Marchetti kept the girl steady. Josie Lambert had followed the standoff with wide, frightened eyes, certain somehow that all of it was her fault, that the spilled tray had set the whole terrible machine in motion. Marchetti put a hand light on her shoulder and said, without looking away from the head table, "Chin up. This isn't about you either." Her eyes were on the stir at the front now, reading it the way she read everything. The aide moving fast, the Admiral's head turning. She had spent a life knowing the exact second a situation changed, feeling it in the air, the way some people feel weather, and she felt this one change. The aide reached Rear Admiral Nathaniel Sloan at the center of the head table and bent and said 2 sentences into his ear. Sloan, 57, silver at the temples, a man who had commanded task forces and buried more of his people than he would ever say aloud, set down his glass with a care that was almost tenderness. He looked toward the back of the room. He had been a younger man in 2009, a captain with a joint task force and a map full of valleys, and one of those valleys had gone bad on a cold morning, and he had sat in a dim operations center listening to a company fight for its life, and to one voice on the net that would not stay behind the wall. He had read the after-action report 100 times. He had signed the recommendation himself. He had stood in the marble room 2 years later and watched them drape the ribbon, and he had shaken the hand of a sergeant who could not quite meet his eyes because the whole thing hurt her too much to enjoy. He knew that face. He would have known it in the dark. He knew it now, across 300 people, before the aide had finished the second sentence. Knew it from the valley and the citation and a morning 17 years gone that he had never once managed to leave behind. Priscilla, feeling the current in the room shift and misreading it entirely, took it for triumph. The Admiral was rising. Surely he was rising to thank her, to acknowledge at last the woman who kept order at his ball, who did the thankless work of deciding who belonged. She touched her hair. She smoothed the front of her gown. She arranged her face to receive him. An admiral halfway out of his chair. A wife certain she was about to be praised, and a soldier by the door who still had not said her own name. If you want to be in the room when 300 people learn all at once who she is, stay with it. And subscribe to Honor Tales so you never miss the moment the truth walks across the floor. Before the room could learn, it is right that you should. 2009, a valley with one road in and mountains on every other side, a place the maps gave a number and the men gave worse names. Sergeant Adele Marchetti was 27 years old, a combat medic 3 deployments deep, and on a cold morning in that valley, the outpost was on fire. It had come at dawn, the way the bad ones always did. Mortars first, walking in from the ridgeline. Then the long guns from the high ground. Then the push, men pouring down through the rocks, while the little outpost woke into chaos. Within 20 minutes, the position was a place of smoke and noise and soldiers going down, and Marchetti was the only medic on it. There were 4 wounded scattered across open ground between the wire and the collapsing north wall, and the open ground was 800 meters of nothing, with rounds walking across it the entire time, kicking up dirt in long, stitched lines. She crossed it 3 times. The first time she brought back a rifleman with a shattered leg, dragging him by his harness while the dirt jumped around them both, talking to him the whole way, in the flat, calm voice that told him he was going to live. The second time, she brought back 2 more. One over each shoulder for the last brutal stretch, a thing that should not have been possible for a woman her size, and was possible anyway, because she would not set them down. Over the radio, the company commander had ordered her to hold at the wall. She had heard him. She had gone back out anyway, into the 800 meters of open ground, because a medic who holds at the wall while her people bleed in the dirt is not a medic she knew how to be. The ridge had a machine gun on it by then, working the flat in long, patient sweeps, and she had learned the rhythm of it the way you learn a tide, timing her runs to the pauses, flat to the ground in the gaps, up and moving again in the spaces between. It was arithmetic, done at a dead run with her own life as the remainder, and she had solved it 3 times and been wrong about it only once. The numbers of that morning were later written into a citation, spelled out in the flat language the Army uses for the things it cannot otherwise hold. 800 meters, 3 crossings, 4 soldiers, under sustained and accurate enemy fire, without regard for her own life. The 4th soldier was Corporal Wes Kilmer. He was 21. He had a photograph of a dog tucked into his helmet band and a habit of saving his dessert for the youngest private on the team, and he had made her laugh exactly twice in a deployment that had offered very few reasons to. She reached him on the 3rd crossing, and she did everything her hands knew how to do, everything the training and the deployments and the long red nights had ever taught her, and it was not enough. The valley took him anyway, there in the open ground, with her hands still on him. She carried him out regardless. She would not leave him in the open. That, too, went into the citation, in its own flat line, and it was the line she could never read aloud without leaving the room. 2 years later, they gave her the Medal of Honor for that morning. It was 2011, and she was 29, and she stood in a marble room while a voice she barely heard read the flat lines aloud. 800 meters, 3 crossings, 4 soldiers, and 2 hands lowered a light blue ribbon over her head from behind, and the weight of it settled at her throat like a hand she would carry there for the rest of her life. There were cameras, there were speeches, there was a long line of important people who wanted to be photographed beside her, and she stood through all of it with the same stillness she would later bring to a ballroom, and the whole time she thought about the one name that was not being read, the one soldier the morning had kept. She has worn the small rosette for it ever since, on every formal thing she owns, and she has quietly hated every single room that tried to make it about her, because it was never about her. It was about a valley, and 4 soldiers, and one she could not bring home, and a debt that a medal does not pay, and a good soldier carries to the grave. She had come tonight as a favor. A friend's daughter was being commissioned. There were guests to look after. Someone had asked Adele quietly whether she would come and stand in the room and lend it a little weight, and she had said yes, because she always said yes to that. She had asked to be listed as no one. She had worn the plain gown on purpose. The only thing she would not take off, the only thing she never took off, was the small blue rosette on her lapel. Not to be seen, because taking it off felt like leaving Kilmer in the open ground a second time. The room thought it was deciding whether to seat her. It did not know it had been failing all night, a test it had never been told it was taking. Priscilla Vaughn came down the length of the floor to finish what her husband had been too slow to finish. She had decided, in the way of someone who has never once been wrong out loud, to remove the woman herself, in full view of the head table, so that everyone would see who governed this ballroom. She came with her chin high and her heels sharp on the marble, and she took Adele Marchetti by the arm, took her, fingers closing on the bare skin above the elbow, and she pulled. "Out," Priscilla said, loud enough to carry now, because she wanted it to carry. And take off that cheap little pin before you embarrass yourself in front of real officers. Honestly. Coming to a ball like this dressed off a clearance rack and pinning on some trinket, as if anyone would be fooled. She flicked the rosette with one manicured finger, contempt made physical, in front of 300 witnesses. Adele Marchetti looked down at the hand on her arm. Then she looked up at Priscilla Vaughn, and for the first time all evening, she smiled. It was not a hard smile. There was something almost gentle in it, the patience of a person who has seen how these things end, and is sorry for the one who has not yet learned. "You should let go," Marchetti said. It was not a threat. It was a mercy, offered quietly. One last exit before the door closed for good. Whitlock arrived at her shoulder, and his voice came down over the nearest tables like a bulkhead ceiling. "Ma'am, take your hand off the recipient." The word landed in the noise and stopped it, table by table, in a spreading ring. Recipient. The people nearest turned. The word did not belong to a +1 in a plain dress. It belonged to something else entirely, something the older officers in the room had spent their whole careers being taught to stand up for. And those close enough to hear, it began, one by one, to understand that they had been misreading the entire evening. A retired colonel at a nearby table was the first to move. He was old enough to have earned his knowledge the hard way, and he was on his feet before he had fully decided to be, the reflex of 40 years pulling him upright at the sound of that single word. His wife looked up at him in confusion. He did not explain. He only stood, facing the back of the room, and by standing, he told everyone near him what the word meant, and the understanding spread outward from him like rings from a stone. And across the ballroom, Rear Admiral Nathaniel Sloan was already moving, up out of his chair, around the end of the head table, out onto the open floor. The quartet faltered and went silent mid-phrase. 300 faces turned with him, following the line of his walk to its end, at the back doors, where a wife stood with her hand on a soldier's arm and did not yet understand what she had done. A wife with her grip on a soldier's arm. An admiral crossing a silent ballroom, and one word hanging over all of it. Recipient, that not one of the cruel yet understood. Admiral Sloan crossed the last of the floor, and the room held its breath, and everyone braced for the thing they expected. A shout, a rank thrown down, security summoned. The disturbance ended and swept away. None of that happened. Sloan walked past Priscilla Vaughn as though she were furniture. He did not look at her. He stopped in front of Adele Marchetti, and he came to attention. A rear admiral, 2 stars, come to attention before a woman in a plain gown at the back of a ballroom, and he held it. "Sergeant Marchetti," he said, and his voice was not the voice of command now, but something quieter and much harder to bear. "I read your citation the day it was written. I had the task force that morning. I have thought about that valley every year since, and I never once forgot your name." He offered her his arm, not to remove her, to escort her forward. Then he turned to the room, and he raised his voice so that the farthest table would hear it, and he said 4 words that rearranged the evening. "On your feet. Now." 300 people rose. It went through the ballroom like wind across a field. The scrape of chairs, the rustle of dress uniforms coming upright, generals and colonels, and their wives standing because an admiral had told them to, and the older, among them, standing because they had already understood why, and were ashamed it had taken them so long. Ezra Whitlock was rigid at attention before the last word had left Sloane's mouth. There was no formation. There was no shouted call sign. There was only a whole room on its feet for a woman it had spent the night sending to the back. And that was the salute, and it was the largest one most of them would ever be part of. It was a strange and terrible sound. 300 people standing at once. The long scrape of chairs, the settling rustle of dress uniforms, and then a silence so complete you could hear the candles. Old soldiers stood the way old soldiers stand, spines finding a line they had not held in years. Young officers stood a beat late, copying the old ones, understanding only that something had happened that was bigger than the room and their place in it. The wives stood because their husbands stood, and in the middle of that standing sea, at the very back where the current had carried her, Adele Marchetti stood exactly as still as she had stood all night, because the one thing she had never learned to do was accept a room getting to its feet for her. Priscilla Vaughan's face did the whole terrible journey in the space of a single breath. First confusion. Why was the Admiral bowing his head to the back table? Why was the room standing? Then disbelief. The pin, the cheap little pin she had flicked, was real, was the realest thing in the entire building. Then recognition. The name, Marchetti, the medal, the light blue ribbon, the one decoration a lifetime near the army had taught her to revere without ever expecting to meet. And last of all, horror, pure and complete, as she understood exactly what she had done, and in front of exactly whom, and that there was no chair anywhere in the world she could send this to. She still had the memory of the rosette on her fingertip. She had flicked the Medal of Honor. Sloane walked Marchetti forward through the standing room, down the length of the floor she had been marched along at the start of the night, and he seated her at the head table, at the front, in the seat of honor, because a Medal of Honor recipient is seated first, and the room stands, and no chart made by a colonel's wife has ever once outweighed that. The seating Priscilla had spent all evening building was rewritten in 10 seconds by a tradition older than her marriage. And Colonel Gerald Vaughan stood frozen behind his own name card, looking at his wife, then at the woman now seated, where the most honored guest is always seated, understanding that his evening was over. And, in the arithmetic of every senior officer now watching him, a good deal more than his evening. The woman sent to the back of the room was seated at the front of it, and the only person in 300 still standing where she had started was the wife who had put her there. What followed was not an arrest. No one was handcuffed. No court was convened. The reckoning at a thing like this is quieter than that, and far heavier. It moved through the room at the speed of understanding. The senior officers who had spent the evening deferring to Priscilla Vaughan now found reasons to be elsewhere whenever she came near, and the wives who had laughed toward the back table found their own drinks suddenly very interesting. The general officer present crossed the floor to the head table and thanked Adele Marchetti with both hands and a bowed head, and made a point, a visible and deliberate point, of not thanking his hosts on his way back. Colonel Vaughan stood in the middle of a room that had recalibrated around him, and every glance that slid off him carried the same silent verdict. This is the officer who let his wife run a ballroom and flick a recipient's medal and try to have her thrown into the street. No board would ever say it aloud. No board would need to. His name would carry it now into every room his name went, and the brigade command he had spent 3 years angling for would quietly find another man. That was the consequence. Not a cell. A memory in the mind of everyone who mattered that would not fade. He crossed to the head table once, late, to offer his own apology, man to soldier, the only currency he had left, and Adele Marchetti heard him out to the end, because she was not cruel and never had been. When he finished, she said only, "You had a good soldier standing in your own doorway trying to tell you all night. You should have listened to your sergeant major." It was not said to wound. It was the plainest kind of truth, offered without heat, and it was worse than anything she could have shouted, because he knew it was fair. He went back to his seat a smaller man than he had risen from it, and the room let him go, and that was all the room would ever do about him. But it would be enough. Rear Admiral Sloane lingered a moment at her shoulder, before the program resumed, and said quietly that the valley had cost him sleep for 17 years, and that seeing her whole and standing had given a little of it back. Marchetti told him what she told everyone who tried to thank her for that morning, that she had brought out 4 and lost 1, and that the math had never once come out even, no matter how many rooms stood up. He nodded. He was old enough to know she was right, and old enough to know it did not lessen what she had done, and wise enough not to argue the point with her at her own back table on a night she had never wanted. Adele Marchetti, seated in the place of honor she had never asked for, wanted only one thing from it, and she asked the Admiral for it quietly. "Seat the lieutenant's wife next to me," she said. "The young one from the back." She was kind when no one else in this room could be bothered. And so Josie Lambert, who had begun the night sent to the farthest chair for the crime of marrying a junior man, was brought to the head table and seated beside a Medal of Honor recipient in front of the whole standing room, while Priscilla Vaughn was left at the back she had built for other people. Marchetti poured the girl a glass of water with her own hand and said something low that made her laugh, really laugh, for the first time all night. And that was the only revenge Adele Marchetti took, and it was complete. Priscilla tried, once, to cross to the head table. She had spent a lifetime learning that a warm word and a warmer smile could smooth over anything, and she came forward now, with both ready, some half-formed sentence about a terrible misunderstanding already shaping in her mouth. But the room had changed its weather, and she felt it before she reached the front. The way people did not quite look at her, the small, courteous distance that opened around her wherever she stepped, the sense of having become, in the space of 10 minutes, a thing the room was too polite to name and too disgusted to forgive. She stopped halfway. She did not finish the sentence. There was, she understood at last, no version of it that would land. She had flicked the highest honor the country gives, in a room full of people who had spent their lives serving the flag it hangs on, and there was no smile in the world wide enough to cover that. Here is the thing worth carrying out of that ballroom. Dignity does not announce itself. It does not police a seating chart, or measure a woman by her husband's rank, or flick another person's ribbon to feel taller. The quietest person in that room was carrying the most, and she carried it to the back without a word, and she would have left from the back without a word if the room had let her. If that lands somewhere in you, follow this channel, subscribe to Honor Tales, and stay for the next one. The coda was quiet and clean, the way she wanted it. She slipped out before dessert. She had taken nothing the room finally offered her. Not the seat, not the standing, not the apologies that came stammering late from people who had laughed early. She tucked the small blue rosette back under her wrap as she went, out of the light, the way she always did, because it had never been for the light. Ezra Whitlock walked her to the doors, matching her pace, saying nothing until they reached them, because some things do not need words between two soldiers who already understand each other. At the door, he stopped. He looked at her, and he said the only thing that fit. For Kilmer. Adele Marchetti stopped too. Something moved behind her eyes, there and gone. The valley, the open ground, the boy with the dog in his helmet band. For Kilmer, she said. Then she went out into the cool of the night, a soldier going home, no motorcade waiting, and no theater left to cross, carrying what she had always carried, and nothing the ballroom had tried to give her. She had come as no one. She left as no one. And the room she left behind would tell the story for years anyway, the way rooms do, until it became the thing every one of them swore they had understood from the very first minute. The woman in the plain gown, the small blue pin, the wife who sat her in back, and the Admiral who stood the room up and sat her at the front, Every soldier carries a story that few ever hear. Listen with your heart. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to Honor Tales for more.